The book It's Not You by Dr. Ramani Durvasuia is a book that simply everyone who has dealt with or is dealing with narcissists must read. It's a guiding light to recognizing, avoiding, and recovering from narcissistic relationships. Drawing from over 2 decades of experience studying narcissism, Dr. Durvasuia provides practical advice and expert tips for dealing with the challenges posed by narcissistic individuals. The book emphasizes that coping with a narcissist is not the victim's fault. Dr. Durvasuia explains how narcissists manipulate and invalidate others, leading to gaslighting, wrecked self-esteem, and a sense of confusion and self-blame in their victims. Through detailed case studies and insights, she helps readers recognize the telltale signs of narcissistic behavior, such as constant validation seeking, delusional grandiosity, entitlement, and lack of empathy. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Durvasuia presents ways for healing and reclaiming one's sense of self following narcissistic abuse. This contains tactics for becoming gaslight-resistant, breaking away from trauma attachments, establishing realistic boundaries, and healing from the emotional toll of the relationship. The book gives assistance and support for those who choose to continue relationships with narcissists, including coping mechanisms and suggestions for self-protection. It's Not You is a beacon of hope to individuals who have been in narcissistic relationships, giving validation, support, and practical skills for healing and moving on. Exploring the thin line between charm and abuse, Ramani Durvasuia explores the very much complex and often misunderstood concept of narcissism by presenting 2 scenarios involving individuals, Carlos and Adam, each exhibiting behaviors that might be interpreted as narcissistic by their partners. Durvasuia then proceeds to dissect what narcissism truly is, shedding light on various traits and patterns associated with it. Her central thesis revolves around the fact that narcissism is more than just being self-centered or vain. Rather, it encompasses a range of behaviors and attitudes that can manifest differently in individuals, from mild to severe forms. The defining characteristic of narcissism lies in the consistent display of these traits, often resulting in harm to others. Durvasuia highlights that narcissistic behavior is driven by deep-seated insecurity and a need for control and validation, leading to manipulative and abusive tendencies. She explores the different facets of narcissism, such as the relentless pursuit of validation, narcissistic supply, egocentricity, inconsistent behavior, restlessness, grandiosity, entitlement, and a lack of empathy. She also discusses how narcissistic individuals often project their insecurities onto others, engage in passive-aggressive behaviors, and possess a charming facade that can be deceptive. By dissecting these traits and behaviors, Durvasuia aims to demystify narcissism and debunk common misconceptions surrounding it. She points out the importance of recognizing narcissistic tendencies in relationships and understanding the impact they can have on individuals' well-being. Ultimately, she argues that gaining clarity on narcissism can be essential for navigating relationships and setting healthy boundaries. Challenging stereotypes surrounding narcissism, Durvasuia discusses the continuum of narcissism, challenging the simplistic notion that narcissism is a binary trait. Instead, she brings out that narcissism exists on a spectrum, ranging from mild to severe. Durvasuia also explores the characteristics of moderate narcissism, which is the focus of her book, using a case study of a married couple to illustrate typical behaviors and patterns associated with this level of narcissism. She discusses the different types of narcissism, including grandiose, vulnerable, communal, self-righteous, neglectful, and malignant narcissism, highlighting how each type manifests and affects interpersonal relationships differently. How communal narcissists, for example, seek validation through perceived altruistic acts, while self-righteous narcissists exhibit judgmental and rigid behavior. Readers get to learn about some of the most common misconceptions about narcissism and its diagnosis, advocating for a nuanced understanding of narcissistic traits and behaviors. She argues against the overuse of the term narcissism without proper distinction between traits and clinical diagnosis, emphasizing the importance of accurately identifying and acknowledging narcissistic behavior to protect oneself from harmful relationships. Additionally, she questions the validity and utility of diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder, suggesting that the focus should be on recognizing and addressing problematic personality traits rather than assigning clinical labels. She seeks to give raw insight into the complexity of narcissism, as well as to enable people to improve their interactions with narcissists. While grandiose narcissism is more commonly associated with men, narcissism can be found in individuals of all genders. Stereotypes about narcissism being a predominantly male trait can lead to overlooking or downplaying toxic behaviors in women. Narcissistic individuals often engage in manipulative behaviors such as gaslighting and contemptuous dismissal to leave others feeling inferior. Contrary to the belief that narcissistic behavior is uncontrollable, narcissists usually exhibit strategic behavior control. They may behave charmingly in front of certain people while unleashing their rage on those closest to them when no one else is around. Personality change, even under the influence of trauma or other significant experiences, is challenging and requires considerable effort and commitment. Narcissistic traits are deeply ingrained and resistant to change, especially since many narcissists lack self-awareness or the desire to change. Narcissism can coexist with other mental health disorders, such as ADHD, addiction, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, impulse control disorders, and PTSD. This overlap can complicate diagnosis and treatment, as narcissistic behaviors may mask or exacerbate symptoms of other disorders. Recognizing narcissistic behavior patterns is crucial for setting boundaries and protecting oneself from emotional harm. It's important not to excuse or justify harmful behavior by attributing it solely to other mental health issues. Raising awareness about narcissistic abuse and its detrimental effects on victims. The main focus here is on how narcissistic behavior patterns, such as manipulation, entitlement, gaslighting, and rage, systematically erode the well-being and sense of self of the individuals involved. The narrative centers around Jordan, whose father exhibits classic narcissistic traits. Jordan's father demands constant validation and control, manipulating and emotionally abusing his family to maintain his inflated self-image. Jordan's attempts to seek his father's approval and love only result in further disappointment and emotional turmoil. Durvasuia defines narcissistic abuse as a pattern of harmful, deceitful, and invalidating behaviors perpetrated by individuals with narcissistic or antagonistic personalities. These behaviors serve to assert control and dominance while inflicting psychological harm on the victim. The abuse alternates with periods of connection and comfort, complicating the victim's perception of the relationship. Gaslighting emerges as a central tactic of narcissistic abuse, involving the systematic manipulation of the victim's reality, memories, and emotions. By sowing doubt and questioning the victim's sanity, gaslighting allows the narcissistic individual to maintain power and control. The dimmer patterns, dismissiveness, invalidation, minimization, manipulation, exploitativeness, and rage, illustrate the various ways narcissists devalue their victims. These behaviors gradually erode the victim's sense of self and well-being, leaving them feeling small and powerless. Narcissistic abuse is rooted in the need for domination. Narcissists seek to control various aspects of their partner's life, including schedules, finances, and social interactions, as a way to assert their dominance. They use manipulation, threats, and isolation to maintain control over their partner. They employ tactics such as arguing, blame-shifting, criticism, and humiliation to maintain control and dominance in the relationship. They refuse to take responsibility for their actions and often justify their behavior through manipulation and rationalization. Narcissistic abuse usually involves lying, infidelity, and making false promises to keep the partner emotionally invested in the relationship. Betrayal undermines trust and security, leaving the victim feeling devastated and manipulated. Narcissistic relationships are characterized by transactional intimacy, where the narcissist gives affection and attention only when it serves their needs. Victims often feel deprived of emotional support and love, leading to a sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction. Durvasuia outlines the typical cycle of narcissistic relationships, starting with idealization, love bombing, followed by devaluation and discard. Despite the abusive behavior, narcissists may attempt to reconcile and pull the victim back into the relationship, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Love bombing is an initial phase of intense affection and attention that narcissists use to seduce and manipulate their partners. It creates a sense of euphoria and emotional dependence, making it difficult for the victim to recognize abusive behavior. Empowering survivors to recognize and break free from the cycle of abuse. Durvasuia explains how narcissists use love bombing as a manipulative tactic to draw their victims into relationships, by showering them with excessive attention, compliments, and affection. This initial phase creates a sense of specialness and connection for the victim. The concept of trauma bonding is explored, illustrating how victims become entangled in abusive relationships due to deep emotional ties that develop alongside the abuse. These bonds, often stemming from childhood experiences with narcissistic parents, make it challenging for victims to recognize the toxicity of the relationship and leave. She outlines the phases individuals experience in narcissistic relationships, from initially being unaware of the dynamics to feeling trapped and overwhelmed by self-doubt and manipulation. These phases encompass the love bombing, devaluation, discarding, and hoovering stages, each playing a role in perpetuating the cycle of abuse. The psychological toll of narcissistic abuse is explained in detail, shedding light on the impact it has on victims' self-esteem, mental health, and overall well-being. Durvasuia discusses common patterns of behavior and thought that emerge as a result of narcissistic abuse, such as self-blame, rumination, and attempts to appease the narcissist. Durvasuia introduces the concept of the three rupees: regret, rumination, and euphoric recall, which encapsulate the cyclical nature of narcissistic relationships. Even after leaving the relationship, survivors often find themselves trapped in these patterns, highlighting the importance of therapy and support in healing from narcissistic abuse. From victimhood to empowerment. Through recognizing the patterns, we get to learn some of the psychological repercussions of narcissistic abuse, as the author points out how victims often internalize blame for the abusive behavior they endure. Victims question their role in the abuse due to gaslighting and a desire for control. Durvasuia also goes into depth about the dynamics of narcissistic relationships, explaining how victims may overlook betrayals to maintain their attachment to the abuser. Shame and confusion are common experiences for victims as they navigate contradictory actions and emotions from the narcissist. The author discusses the profound impact of narcissistic abuse on mental and physical health, from exacerbating mental health issues like depression and anxiety to manifesting in stress-related illnesses. Due to chronic mistrust and suspicion, victims often struggle with trust and building healthy relationships. Despite the challenges, Durvasuia also points out the possibility of recovery and healing from narcissistic abuse. Victims can shift their focus from survival to growth and self-understanding, whether they choose to stay in the relationship or leave. She teaches the readers about the power of recognizing narcissistic abuse as a crucial step toward healing. Victims may grapple with feelings of grief, loss, and self-doubt during the healing process, which requires patience and self-compassion. She explores various vulnerabilities that predispose individuals to narcissistic relationships, such as a lack of awareness of manipulative behaviors and difficult transitions. She also examines the roles within a narcissistic family system, shedding light on the psychological harm inflicted on children. All of these findings take us deeper into the specifics of narcissistic abuse, its effects on victims' well-being, and the path to recovery and healing. Recognizing patterns, setting boundaries, and seeking help are critical steps toward breaking the cycle of abuse and fostering healthier relationships. Finding freedom through radical acceptance. Here, we get familiarized with the concept of radical acceptance in the context of narcissistic relationships. Ramani starts by drawing parallels between the behavior of a narcissistic person and that of a scorpion in the story of the scorpion and the swan. Despite promises and charm, both the scorpion and the narcissist ultimately exhibit harmful behavior. Durvasuia emphasizes that understanding why narcissistic people behave as they do is less important for healing than accepting the reality that their behavior is consistent and unlikely to change. She clarifies that radical acceptance does not mean condoning or submitting to the mistreatment endured in a narcissistic relationship. Instead, it involves acknowledging the situation's reality and recognizing that the narcissist's behavior is unlikely to improve. By accepting this truth, Individuals can redirect their energy towards their healing rather than futilely attempting to change the narcissist or the relationship dynamics. She shares some examples of individuals who reached a point of radical acceptance after enduring narcissistic relationships for many years. Similarly, Louisa realized her partner would never change after repeatedly experiencing disappointment. At the same time, Costa, initially resistant to the idea of narcissism in his relationship, eventually acknowledged the reality of his situation. She promotes radical acceptance as a path to recovery, allowing people to let go of their desire for change and focus on themselves and healthy relationships. Durvasuia recognizes the challenge of acknowledging the inevitability of a narcissistic dynamic, particularly when hope for reform remains. She sees optimism as a fundamental impediment to radical acceptance, frequently prompting people to rationalize or excuse being in poisonous situations. Also, we learn that radical acceptance does not necessarily require leaving the relationship, but rather a shift in expectations and a clear-eyed view of the relationship dynamics. It involves recognizing that the narcissistic person's behavior will not change and that the relationship may not provide safety or support. She acknowledges the emotional toll of radical acceptance, including feelings of grief, guilt, and helplessness. However, she emphasizes the courage and resilience required to confront the painful truth of a narcissistic relationship and make choices that prioritize self-protection and healing. In the case of staying in the relationship, radical acceptance means recognizing the limitations and challenges while setting realistic expectations. It involves understanding one's reasons for staying, such as financial constraints, family ties, societal expectations, or fear, and learning to disengage from the narcissistic person's manipulative behaviors. By accepting the situation for what it is, individuals can focus on nurturing healthy relationships, pursuing meaningful interests, and setting boundaries to protect themselves. Coming out from the maze, healing from the narcissistic abuse. Finally, Durvasuia goes into multiple facets of recovery from narcissistic abuse, stressing the devastating influence it has on people's emotional, psychological, and bodily well-being. She focuses on the grief and healing journey specific to narcissistic relationships, pointing out how the dynamics of such relationships, characterized by the projection of shame, loss of identity, and lack of validation, contribute to a unique form of grief. This grief is often disenfranchised, meaning it's not widely recognized or validated by society, which can exacerbate feelings of isolation and marginalization. She shares some tips and methods for coping with grief, including acknowledging loss, engaging in the grieving process, and focusing on self-recovery. She also mentions the theme of injustice in narcissistic relationships and its impact on the healing process. Victims often struggle to find closure or meaning in their grief due to the lack of accountability from the narcissistic abuser. Healing becomes challenging in the absence of justice, but therapy, support groups, and grief rituals can provide avenues for processing grief and reclaiming agency. We learn the profound importance of becoming resistant to narcissistic dynamics by setting boundaries and developing resilience. We also get to know about the physiological effects of narcissistic abuse on the body, mainly through the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, SNS. Individuals experiencing narcissistic abuse often exhibit heightened SNS responses, leading to chronic stress and arousal. She shares some techniques for managing these physiological reactions by engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, through relaxation techniques and self-awareness. Recognizing past traumas and understanding how they influence perceptions of threat is also crucial for mitigating SNS responses and promoting overall well-being. Final notes. Drawing from over 20 years of experience studying narcissism, Dr. Durvasuia provides deep insights into the dynamics of narcissistic relationships and offers practical strategies for recovery. The book teaches how narcissists manipulate and invalidate others, leaving them questioning their worth and sanity. It accentuates that victims of narcissistic abuse are not to blame and guides readers through the process of understanding and healing from the trauma inflicted by narcissistic individuals. Key topics covered in the book include identifying narcissistic behavior, becoming resistant to gaslighting, breaking free from trauma bonds, establishing healthy boundaries, and reclaiming a sense of self-worth and autonomy. Dr. Durvasuia addresses various forms of narcissistic abuse, including parental,